I kept quiet when my older brother Mason stole my brand new car, not because I was weak or afraid of him, but because I had hidden something inside it that he never suspected, something small and silent that sat in the trunk like a seed waiting for the right moment to sprout. When the police called me days later and told me where my car had been found, the room froze in shock, and I realized that staying silent had been the most powerful choice I had ever made. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to pause for a second to say that your like or comment truly helps me keep sharing stories like this, stories that cut to the heart of family drama and justice. And your support means more to me than you can imagine, because it keeps these voices alive and gives me the strength to keep telling them. My name is Sarah, I am 27 years old, and I grew up in a family where keeping peace was considered the highest duty, even when peace meant burying your own needs so deeply you could hardly breathe under their weight. Mason, who is 35, has always had a way of taking what he wanted and dressing it up as a favor or a joke, as if smiling while robbing you of your belongings somehow softened the cruelty of it. I had worked for 2 long years to buy my silver hybrid, cutting corners, skipping vacations, taking extra shifts, dreaming of the freedom that would come with owning something new and clean and fully mine. Yet, the very week I drove it home with the smell of fresh upholstery still clinging to the seats, Mason appeared at my door with that easy grin and that practiced charm, and before the weekend ended, the car was gone, and so was my sense of triumph. At first, I tried to believe it was temporary, that maybe he just needed to show off for a night, or that he would return it once the novelty wore off. But then came the selfies he posted with his friends, where my car shone in the background like a trophy. And then came the messages in the family group chat where he called it a test drive. And suddenly my parents were looking at me like I should just laugh along. Because that was Mason. He had always been that way. He had always taken and twisted. And wasn't it easier to smile than to fight? But inside me, a different kind of silence was growing. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of preparation, because 2 months before I bought the car, I had quietly installed a GPS tracker in the trunk, not out of paranoia, but out of practicality. A simple precaution for a young woman who wanted to feel secure. And now that little dot glowing on my phone was the only reason I could breathe without choking on anger. I didn't storm to his place or call him screaming. I didn't even tell my parents what I knew. I simply opened the app each night and watched the trail my car was leaving as Mason paraded it through the city, parking it in places that told a story of their own, places that didn't look like errands or joyrides, but like something else entirely, something that didn't match his swaggering explanations. And when one evening the dot settled behind a storage facility on the edge of town, my stomach tightened because I knew I wasn't the only one he had fooled, and this wasn't going to end with a sheepish apology or a returned set of keys. This was going to pull me into something deeper, something far darker than I had imagined when I first saw him slide behind the wheel and wave like he was doing me a favor. Mason didn't just take my car, he turned the theft into a performance, flaunting it in ways that made my stomach twist with every passing day. He posted photos of himself leaning against the hood as though he had just signed the papers at the dealership, his grin wide and careless while his friends raised drinks in the background, and each photo felt like another slap in the face for the years of work I had poured into saving for that car. My parents saw those posts and sighed with an exhausted tenderness that sounded almost like excuses, urging me not to make a scene, reminding me that family harmony was fragile and that Mason always burned bright and fast while I had been the steady one. But their attempts to soothe me only deepened the injustice, because instead of defending me, they kept defending the son who had taken what was mine and paraded it like a trophy. What gnawed at me most was not the fact that he had my car, but the way he treated it like a disposable toy, parking it carelessly in different parts of town, leaving it in crowded streets where scratches seemed inevitable, and even bragging in the family group chat about how it handled on late-night drives. I would stare at those messages, my finger hovering over the keyboard wanting to write something sharp and cutting, but I held back because silence was my strategy, and silence was my shield. And I knew that blurting out my anger too soon would only burn the leverage I had built by keeping track of his every move through the glowing dot on my phone screen. Yet the more I watched the path of my car, the more uneasy I became, because Mason wasn't just driving, he was circling places that felt wrong. Body shops, back alleys, and late-night stops near storage units that didn't fit the casual joyride narrative. It wasn't long before he escalated his audacity, asking me for money to fill the tank as though the car still belonged to me in name, but had become his in practice. He said it with the breezy confidence of someone who had always found ways to dip into my wallet, his tone half joking, half demanding, and it took everything in me not to laugh out loud at the absurdity of it. To anyone else it might have looked like harmless sibling banter, but to me it was yet another reminder that Mason had no boundaries, no respect for my sacrifices, and no intention of returning what he had taken unless it no longer served his ego. I wanted to scream, to drag him by the ear back to reality, but instead I bit down on my frustration and opened the tracker app again, committing myself to patience because every careless move he made was another thread tightening around him, another piece of evidence that would one day turn the tables. One particular night, as I stared at the glowing screen, I saw the dot stop behind a storage facility on the outskirts of town, and I felt a chill ripple through me because that wasn't just reckless joyriding anymore, that was deliberate. My heart raced as I imagined my car being hidden, traded, or stripped for parts, and the thought of it disappearing forever should have broken me, but instead it lit a strange fire in my chest because I realized I wasn't powerless. With every mile Mason drove, with every stop he made, he was writing his own confession in real time, and all I had to do was keep collecting the lines until the story was undeniable. I closed the app, pulled the covers tighter around me, and told myself that silence could scream louder than confrontation, and when the time came, Mason would have no idea how much I already knew. The night Mason left my car by the storage facility lingered in my mind, but the real spark came days later when I noticed something only he would have been foolish enough to leave behind. Mason had always been a bragger, the kind of man who couldn't drink a cup of coffee without announcing where it came from, and true to form, he posted a photo online of himself, leaning against my car again. Only this time, I saw something small in the background, a reflection of a sign on the tinted window. It was part of a logo from a shady reseller lot not far from the storage facility, and suddenly the pattern of his movements started to make sense. He wasn't just showing off anymore. He was trying to flip my car for profit, dressing the theft in charm and selfies, while secretly dragging me into something far more serious. The realization made my hands tremble, but alongside the fear came a flicker of satisfaction, because his vanity had handed me the proof I needed. I stared at the screenshot on my phone for a long time, my thoughts racing. What if this was my chance, the first real break in his reckless game? What if the very flaw that had always made him unbearable, his endless need for attention, could become the rope that tied him down? It was the first time in weeks I felt the scales tilt slightly in my direction, and though I didn't yet know how to act, I felt the stirrings of control again. It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about watching a man who thought he was untouchable trip over his own ego. I tucked the photo away in a new folder I had started on my phone, a folder I named Receipts, and in that moment I knew I wasn't simply enduring anymore, I was preparing. What unsettled me, though, was how brazen Mason was becoming. The GPS showed the car spending hours parked in front of that lot, and my mind started weaving scenarios of him chatting with strangers, flashing fake paperwork, convincing someone he had the right to sell what wasn't his. Each thought made my chest ache with dread, yet at the same time I recognized the opportunity in his carelessness. His movements weren't random. They were a trail of breadcrumbs leading to a truth bigger than either of us. And while he thought he was clever enough to play games under the radar, I knew that the very things he dismissed as harmless bragging were building a case brick by brick, a case he couldn't charm his way out of. Then came the unexpected twist. A stranger reached out to me with a message that made my pulse leap. They asked if I owned a silver hybrid with a plate that had recently changed, because they had seen one listed under suspicious circumstances and thought it might be stolen. For a moment, my throat closed, because the message confirmed everything I had feared and everything I had suspected. That Mason wasn't just playing with my car, he was pulling me into a network of lies that could explode at any second. But instead of panic, I felt a new kind of clarity, because now it wasn't just my suspicion or my screenshots. It was outside validation. Mason had made himself visible, and the world had started to notice. The stranger's message confirmed what my gut already knew, and that was the moment when patience began to shift into action. I realized that silence alone wouldn't be enough anymore. I needed to start building a clear trail, something solid that couldn't be twisted or erased by Mason's charm or excuses. I filed an official theft claim with my insurance company, making sure every detail was accurate and every word written as calmly as possible, because I knew if Mason tried to spin his way out of this, I wanted my side to look steady and undeniable. I also reached out to the non-emergency police desk and gave them the tracker details, speaking slowly and carefully, letting them see me as someone measured, not emotional, so that when the time came to act, they would already know I wasn't crying wolf. At home, I started setting boundaries that felt both foreign and freeing. When my parents tried to bring up Mason and the car, I told them gently but firmly that I wouldn't be discussing it with family anymore, that any updates would go directly through insurance and the police. Their disappointment stung, but it also reminded me of how often I had been asked to carry silence for the sake of peace. And for once I chose to carry clarity instead. Mason might have thought he held all the power, but what he didn't realize was that every smug photo, every fake listing, and every reckless stop was being quietly documented, not with the fury of a younger sister, but with the precision of someone who understood that time could be the sharpest weapon of all. I started rehearsing possibilities in my head, running through them like quiet drills. What if Mason suddenly apologized and tried to return the car? Would I cave and forgive him, or would I stay the course? What if he blamed me, said I had overreacted, and tried to paint me as dramatic to the rest of the family? Would I let my silence crack then? And what if he dragged my mother into it, begging her to defend him like she always did? Could I stand firm without being cruel? Each scenario made my pulse quicken, but each one also made me stronger, because I could feel myself shifting from the little sister who had always been told to smooth things over into a woman who was willing to hold her ground, no matter how uncomfortable it made everyone else. Then, one evening, as I checked the tracker again, I saw the glowing dot drift toward a lakeside rental house, and my chest tightened with a mix of dread and anticipation. Mason wasn't alone there. My phone soon lit up with a tagged post from one of his friends showing what they proudly called a business mixer. The caption dripped with false glamour, but to me it was just another chance to witness his recklessness in real time. I knew I had to be careful, not to confront him head-on, but to step into the scene quietly, to watch, to gather, to make sure that every piece of his arrogance turned into another layer of evidence. Because I understood something Mason never would. Sometimes the most dangerous voice in the room is the one that doesn't need to shout. The lakeside rental glowed with strings of mismatched lights when I arrived with my two closest friends, Rachel and Noor, who had both insisted on coming along when they learned what Mason was doing. I hadn't told them everything about the tracker, but they knew enough to understand that I needed witnesses. People who could confirm what I saw without the filter of family loyalty clouding the truth. As we walked into the so-called business mixer, it struck me as almost comical how Mason tried to make the gathering look important, like he was some kind of mogul hosting an exclusive networking event. In reality, it was a handful of guys in cheap blazers, too much cologne hanging in the air, and a Bluetooth speaker struggling to keep the music alive. I forced myself to smile and keep my voice light, but every time I glanced out the window and saw my silver hybrid parked with fake temporary plates, I felt a surge of anger pulse beneath my calm surface. Mason spotted me and swaggered over, his grin wide and his words oiled with that usual mix of charm and arrogance, pretending as if nothing was wrong, as if he hadn't stolen my car or plastered it all over social media like a prize. He introduced me around the room as though I should feel flattered to be there, calling me his little sister with that condescending tone that always made my skin crawl, and I played along with a polite laugh, nodding, sipping water, and keeping my eyes open for the details that mattered. I noticed the way people whispered when they thought no one was listening, the sideways glances at the car outside, the casual mentions of connections and deals that sounded more like cover stories than actual business. Every detail I absorbed went into my mental file, each observation another thread that would eventually tighten around him. The absurdity of the scene wasn't lost on me either. At one point, Mason proudly announced that he was about to expand his automotive business, waving his arms like a showman, while one of his friends struggled to keep the chips from blowing away on the porch table. My friends exchanged looks that said everything. This wasn't business, it was a circus, and Mason was the clown who didn't realize his act was about to end. I laughed softly with them, not because I found it funny, but because the humor was a shield that kept me steady. I let Mason think he was impressing everyone, let him think he had pulled me into his little world of self-importance. But deep down, I knew I was collecting the evidence he so carelessly laid out in the open. Then came the moment that shifted everything. As I lingered near the door, pretending to check my phone, a man I didn't recognize leaned closer and muttered something under his breath, his eyes flicking toward my hybrid outside. He said Mason knew a guy who could reassign cars for a fee, and the way he said it made my stomach drop because this wasn't just about joyrides or showing off anymore. It was organized, deliberate, and far bigger than what I had imagined. I nodded calmly, as though the words meant nothing to me, but inside I felt my pulse hammer against my ribs. Mason thought he was untouchable, surrounded by laughter and empty bravado, but I knew the trap was tightening. I didn't need to confront him that night. All I needed to do was wait, watch, and let his arrogance do the work for me. After the lakeside mixer, Mason's recklessness only grew bolder, as if every time he got away with something, it gave him permission to take one step further into madness. I kept watching the tracker, and soon my car appeared on an online marketplace under a fake seller name, its photos edited just enough to blur out the details, but still clear enough for me to recognize the curve of the hood and the tiny scratch near the back bumper I had made while learning to parallel park. Seeing my car advertised as if it were some stranger's possession felt like a punch to the chest, but at the same time, it was undeniable proof of how far Mason was willing to go. He wasn't just joyriding anymore. He was trying to erase my ownership altogether, as though my hard work, my savings, and my name meant nothing in the shadow of his greed. The family pressure returned in full force once the whispers began to spread. My mother called me late one night, her voice trembling, begging me not to ruin Thanksgiving by making things worse. She pleaded for me to just let Mason figure things out, as if selling my car under a fake name was something he could simply fix with an apology and a sheepish grin. Her words sliced deeper than I expected, because it was clear she still clung to the hope that silence and forgiveness could mend what had long been broken. But I knew better. Silence was no longer a shield, it was evidence gathering, and every second I stayed calm, Mason handed me another weapon without even realizing it. What terrified me most, though, was the discovery that Mason had gone through my glove box. I noticed because one night the tracker showed the car lingering near a strip mall bank, and when I checked later, an old insurance card was missing from my files. The thought of him using my information for something darker, fraud, loans, or worse, made my skin crawl because suddenly it wasn't just about the car anymore. He had stepped into my identity, my safety, my very name, and that realization turned fear into steel inside me. It was no longer about waiting for karma to catch up. It was about ensuring that I would not be the one left paying for his mistakes. So I gathered every piece of what I had, screenshots, tracker data, listings, and now the proof of missing documents, and handed it all over to Officer Ramirez, the steady detective I had been in quiet contact with. I spoke carefully, with no anger in my tone, only facts and details, because I wanted them to see me as the reliable voice in a sea of Mason's noise. They told me to sit tight while they coordinated, and I agreed, my heart pounding with both dread and anticipation. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my phone lit up with another tracker alert. Mason had taken the car out again, and this time the glowing dot settled near the same bank where my information had gone missing. My breath caught when, seconds later, my phone rang, and I saw it was the police calling. The moment I saw the word police on my phone screen, my stomach tightened like a fist. I answered with a shaky hello, and Officer Ramirez's calm but firm voice filled my ear. They told me that my car, the one Mason had stolen and paraded around like a toy, had now been linked to a larger investigation involving vehicles that had gone missing and never returned. My hybrid wasn't just a stolen car anymore. It was evidence in a web of fraud and deceit, and Mason had tangled me right into the middle of it without a second thought. I pressed the phone harder against my ear, listening carefully, because I knew this was the turning point. This was the moment where my silence and patience were about to matter more than ever. Ramirez asked if I could provide real-time access to the GPS tracker, and I said yes without hesitation. My hands trembled slightly as I shared the login, knowing that with every blink the little dot was writing Mason's story in glowing lines that no amount of charm could erase. I felt strangely calm in that moment, not triumphant, but grounded, because it was clear now that Mason had no idea how much power he had handed me the night he laughed and drove away in my car. The officer's tone sharpened when they said the vehicle had been seen near a strip mall bank in connection with suspicious financial activity, and the missing insurance card suddenly made sense. My identity, my name, my very safety. He had dangled them in front of strangers like poker chips at a table. I hung up the call and sat in silence, staring at the glow of my phone. What if Mason realized I had been tracking him all along? What if he panicked and did something reckless, dragging me down with him in his spiral? And yet, what if this was the very thread that would finally unravel everything he had built on lies? For once, the what-ifs didn't paralyze me. They sharpened me, made me ready to face the storm I had been preparing for since the night the car vanished. I couldn't control how Mason would react, but I could control my part. Calm, steady, factual. It was the opposite of his chaos, and I knew that contrast would be my shield. In the middle of that restless night, as I forced myself to breathe evenly, I reached for a small bit of humor to steady my nerves. I muted our family group chat, the same one where Mason had called my car a test drive, and I laughed to myself, thinking how my blood pressure deserved hazard pay for being related to him. The levity gave me strength, because I knew the next steps would not be easy. The officer asked me earlier if I'd be willing to come down to the station to identify certain documents that might be connected to my car, and I agreed. My heart raced with anticipation, because deep down, I felt that whatever I was about to see would not just confirm my suspicions, it would expose a truth none of us in the family were ready to face. When I stepped into the police station, the sterile air smelled faintly of paper and coffee, and my heartbeat seemed to echo louder than the footsteps of the officers moving briskly around me. Detective Ramirez led me to a small room and laid out a folder, sliding it across the table with a kind of quiet gravity that made my stomach twist. Inside were photographs of my hybrid, parked in different lots, each time with mismatched plates slapped on carelessly, and I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized how far Mason had pushed things. It wasn't a prank, it wasn't a phase, it was an operation, and he had dragged my car right into the center of it. I stared at those glossy images, the familiar curve of the hood, the scratch on the bumper, the reflection of signs I knew too well, and suddenly I wasn't just looking at a stolen car, I was looking at Mason's unraveling. Then came the insurance card, the one that had gone missing from my glove box, now sealed in a plastic evidence sleeve. Seeing my name staring back at me from that small rectangle felt like a punch to the chest, because it proved Mason wasn't just careless, he was dangerous. If that card had been used for fraud, my life could have been tied to debts I never created, accounts I never opened, crimes I never committed. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to stay steady, to let the weight of that truth settle instead of knocking me over. I thought of every time Mason had laughed off responsibility, every time he had charmed his way past consequences, and I realized this time was different. This time, he had left fingerprints that even his smile couldn't scrub away. Detective Ramirez then turned a screen toward me, pressing play on a short clip of grainy footage from a convenience store camera. There was Mason, clear as day, sliding into frame with my car idling just outside, exchanging an envelope with another man whose face blurred against the fluorescent lights. My heart sank, then hardened, because I knew in that moment the tracker I had installed wasn't just saving my car, it was saving me from being the one framed. Without it, how could I have proven I wasn't part of his scheme? Without it, Mason could have painted me as the careless little sister who handed him documents, or worse, someone who willingly let him use my name. But with it, the story was sharp, undeniable, and finally leaning in my favor. The detective asked if I would be willing to sign a statement, my testimony to support a warrant request, and I nodded without hesitation, my voice calm and sure. It felt surreal to sit there, the quiet peacemaker of my family, suddenly the voice of order in a storm Mason had created. I thought about how every choice I had made to stay silent had been mocked as weakness. But here, in this room, that silence was power. It had allowed me to gather, to watch, to prove. The reversal was almost dizzying, because for the first time in my life, Mason's swagger wasn't the center of the story. Mine was. And as I put pen to paper, the weight of that shift made the room freeze, not in fear, but in recognition that the balance had finally changed. When I left the station that evening, my mind was buzzing with everything I had seen, but the truth kept widening the further I stepped back. Mason's actions weren't just a string of careless choices. They formed a pattern, one that the detective quietly confirmed had stretched back months, maybe even years. Complaints had been filed by people who described the same story in different voices. A friendly guy who offered test drives that never ended, temporary plates that dissolved into thin air, vague promises that turned into vanishing cars. My hybrid wasn't the beginning. It was just the piece that finally tied the puzzle together. Mason hadn't stumbled into trouble. He had built his life on it, brick by stolen brick, and my car was the crack that made the wall start to crumble. Detective Ramirez told me that the so-called business mixer at the lakeside house wasn't a one-time gathering of friends. Two of the people there had filed complaints in the past, men who had been strung along with promises, left lighter in their wallets, and angrier by the day. I thought about the smug way Mason had smiled that night, how he had paraded me around as if I were a prop in his little show, and I realized it was his arrogance that had finally betrayed him. He wasn't careful, he wasn't strategic, he wasn't even particularly clever. He was just lucky that for years no one had stood their ground long enough to stop him. But now, with my evidence stacked and the tracker still pinging, luck was no longer on his side. The most painful truth, though, came when I asked the detective to keep my name as quiet as possible until something formal happened. I knew my family wasn't ready to face what Mason had done, and I wasn't prepared to carry their disappointment on top of everything else. For so long, my silence had been for their sake, to keep them comfortable in the illusion that Mason was just reckless, not criminal. But the reality was harsher, and as much as it hurt, I understood that exposing him meant shattering the fragile version of family we had always clung to. It wasn't about choosing between peace and justice anymore. It was about accepting that sometimes justice destroys false peace, so real healing can begin. Later that night, when I checked the tracker, I saw the dot move again, this time slipping into a quiet suburban neighborhood. My breath caught when I realized the police were already watching it in real time, waiting for the right moment to act. The glowing circle on my phone wasn't just showing me Mason's path anymore, it was showing me the countdown to his reckoning. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight on my chest loosen slightly, because I knew that every mile he drove brought him closer to the truth he had spent his whole life outrunning. It was a Sunday afternoon when the fragile bubble finally burst. My family had gathered for lunch at a small restaurant near town, the kind of place where the clinking of silverware and the soft murmur of conversation usually gave me comfort. Mason arrived late, of course.